Welcome to Indications and Warnings, everyone, with Chuck Farrer, co-produced by Alan Brewer. We're here on day 1002 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine. It is a day both like every other single day in this genocidal war that Russia is waging, but it's a little different because headlines caught everyone's attention this morning, Chuck, of a missile launch by Russia, presumably from a silo. But not every rocket that leaves a silo is an intercontinental ballistic missile, is it?
No, in this case, the information itself evolved. The first assessment was this was a YAR intercontinental ballistic missile. It is now, I think the West has amended its assessment. Putin has claimed it was a missile type, as far as I know, previously unknown, called sycamore tree. That being said, we'll get to the business end. The missile was fired from Astrakhan, which is a region by the Caspian Sea. It traveled the several hundred, almost 1,000 kilometers to Dnipro. This missile has a capability that it carries multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. These are conical shaped objects. As the missile achieves pretty much orbital altitudes, a section of the missile called the MIRV bus separates, a big cylinder. The doors fly off it, and these cones are deployed. In a normal strategic strike, anywhere from 2 to 4, and even as high as 6 of these independently targeted reentry vehicles will be decoys. Now, their flight characteristics, their radar signatures, their ion trails, everything is engineered so that it's difficult or impossible to tell what is a decoy and what is a real weapon. But what we did see in that, frankly, terrifying film, you saw glowing objects streak out of the sky and hit the city of Dnipro. Those were the reentry vehicles heated up to incredible temperatures, and they slammed into the ground at Mach 25. So the simple physics of something moving that fast and hitting anything, there's going to be damage. But this was, again, this was a denuclearized intermediate range ballistic missile. You and I were talking just before we went on. In my estimation, this is a more nuanced thing, we'll get to it, but this is pretty much a crazy neighbor coming out of the front door because kids are skateboarding in front of him and shooting his pistol into the air. So we'll unpack what this means, but also what it doesn't mean.
I think the significant thing about the use of this particular missile is its MIRV, the multi independently targeting reentry vehicles. That's what really sets this weapon apart from any other missile that Russia has launched against Ukraine. It's not like this is the first nuclear capable weapon that Russia has fired at Ukraine. That's not what sets it apart.
Precisely. The Iskander missiles that are lobbed routinely in and at Ukraine, those are also nuclear capable. The Caliber cruise missiles, which are fired indiscriminately, they are also nuclear capable. KH-101, which is an air-launched cruise missile, that's nuclear capable, and the KH-55, also nuclear capable. And I haven't even named every nuclear capable platform that they have used.
So this IRBM that Russia launched was essentially unarmed. All the damage it did in Dnipro was kinetic damage simply from the force of the impact.
Exactly. But you've got something. These MIRVs are about 3 feet tall. They're about, I don't know, 18, 20 inches in diameter. In order to survive the reentry, they are substantial enough, and their metallurgy is such that they can survive at that incredible temperature and also keep the rather delicate nuclear warheads that they carry to allow them to transition from quite literally an extremely high G environment into orbit, and freezing and the temperature change during orbit is amazing. But to me, here's the but. This sort of means nothing. He probably would have damaged Dnipro more by firing 6, 7, 8, 10 Iskanders at it. In fact, they definitely would have done more damage. He elected to do this. This is supposed to terrify the West, that he has taken this step, that he's really serious now. But you were very right to point out, every Iskander could be carrying a nuclear weapon. Every caliber, every K-55, the KH-101s were specifically designed to carry them. So to me, this doesn't mean very much. And one of the footnotes here is also very interesting. He apparently fired 2 of these weapons, and one of them broke up in mid-flight. So you're looking at a 50% failure rate. I consider that significant. I don't know. Maybe other people don't. We had a saying in the SEALs, 1 is none. So it's a good thing he fired 2, because none of them would have arrived on target.
Yeah, the film of this missile strike in Dnipro really is horrifically terrifying. I mean, you can see the independently targeted reentry vehicles doing their damage quite separately. It's like a spider array that's coming down on the city.
Yeah, so Dnipro now has the honor of being the first city in history to be hit with MIRVs. It was definitely apocalyptic in the way it looks, but it's important to let's keep this in context, right? He fired 2 missiles, one of them failed. The other one, which advertises a 100-meter circular error probable, which means if you shoot it at something, this is designed to hit within 100 meters. And when you have hydrogen bombs, that's pretty much a direct hit. But anyone looking at this could see that these MIRVs were not falling at 100 meters off a central port. Now, they may have been targeted individually at spots in the city. That is possible. But generally, there's multiple warheads and multiple decoys to make sure that these weapons get through air defense, which brings us to another topic, doesn't it?
It does. Ukraine has no air defense system that could intercept such a ballistic missile. It's the THAAD system that has not been delivered to Ukraine, has been delivered to Israel, not to put Ukraine and Israel in competition, but without a THAAD system, Ukraine cannot intercept these ballistic missiles.
Yeah, and I think the Patriot has a chance in certain flight regimes, but the THAAD was, that's its meat and potatoes. I think what this shows me, all of us, on reflection, Putin has taken this step, right? He has introduced a new weapon into the war, and he's made this bold move. He has he has basically told the world, look, I'm willing to use the most capable and frightening weapons that I have. Okay, I like to think, why did you do that? What made you take this step? It must have been extraordinary to make you make this step. What are those circumstances? Well, to me, the circumstances are NATO weapons are going to be brought to bear on Russian targets. And heretofore in this war, across the frontier, Putin and his knuckle-dragging generals, they get away with staggering bits of military malpractice, right? 20-mile-long convoys, weapons and missile depots where things are stacked to the ceiling with liquid rocket fuel right next to warheads and everything else. All of that comes into play now. And again, Putin has, through his information warfare, which is superb. You are never going to hear me criticize his information warfare. It's superb. But he has made attackums the dirty word, the buzzword, the poison dart. And now he's reacting to it. And, well, he should.
Well, in his nationwide address to Russians, or really to the world, if the world chose to listen, Putin is saying that because Western weapons are being used on Russian territory, Russia now has the right to strike any nation that is supplying weapons to Ukraine. So this is more nuclear saber rattling, nothing else.
Yeah, I would say to Mr. Putin across the 40-foot table, if you don't like NATO weapons and the very small taste you've gotten, and you are threatening to strike other nations, not your former vassal states, not the nation of Ukraine, which is doing everything it can to tear itself away from the abusive relationship that's existed between Russia and Ukraine for hundreds of years. For example, there is an Aegis Ashore radar station in Poland. This is essentially the radar suite of an Aegis class cruiser, U.S. Navy cruiser. Those ships are incredibly capable, and they are capable of shooting down ballistic missiles in addition to their surface warfare and land attack potential. This has been flouted and floated as a possible Russian target. To our Russian listening guests, it would be a fatal mistake to attack that place. It will be a fatal mistake. Even if you were to take it out, I promise you it would change the dynamics of this war instantly. And I'm not even talking about NATO intervention. I'm talking about more weapons than Ukraine could ever use. And if you are panicked, if you've already taken this highly irrational step, you're not going to like what comes next. Ukraine has about 60 attackums, right? What are you going to do when they have 700, 800? When you and I have talked about this a lot, he does not think ahead. He does not have a contingency tree. This guy's playing crazy eights, and the world is playing bridge.
That's it. I like both those card games. In the de-escalation world, in the White House National Security Council, I don't know if you saw this, but Jake Sullivan had convinced everyone that there was a 50-50 chance that Putin would use a nuclear weapon in this war. And of course, this completely contradicted what Bill Burns, the CIA director, informed the president and all the National Security Council of, that the chance of Russia using a nuclear weapon in this war against Ukraine was practically nil. I'm wondering, I mean, you have worked in the field of nuclear proliferation and have looked at the likelihood of many or any nuclear armed nation using a nuclear weapon in a conflict. 50-50 chance. What's your assessment of that?
No, I categorically don't agree. And I will run for my intellectual top cover. General Mick Ryan doesn't agree with that either, nor does General Hodges. Okay, these are two men, besides being 4-star generals. General Ryan is a 3-star general. Look, they have written books on policy, et cetera. These are extremely well-informed men whose profession was precisely this, to operate and advise at this strategic level. Look, I was a door kicker, right? These guys are operating at that level. But you're right. Look, I've wrote about counterproliferation. I've done it for a long time professionally. I like when people say, oh, it's all OSINT, dude. I tell you what, even if I blew my nose, it had to go in the burn bag. But here's why it isn't like, in the term of art, it's the non-strategic use of nuclear weapons, right? Because generally, nuclear weapons are supposed to be launched at places like Norfolk, Virginia, where you would take out shipbuilding and you'd take out the major base of the Atlantic Fleet. You might hit Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because it had steel making. You would probably want to hit Silicon Valley because it's the intellectual capital. Those are strategic targets. Ukraine doesn't have any strategic targets, right? There is no Norfolk Naval Yard. There are naval yards in Mykolaiv, but they're not making ships anymore. So what is the target in Ukraine? Well, he might nuke Kyiv. Okay, let's think he's going to do that. He can't address a strategic target, and this is, again, the non-strategic use of nuclear weapons. So he's going to do what? He's going to kill 4 million people? How does that advance the war? NATO would have an immediate, instantaneous non-nuclear response, and they might actually respond in kind. What if they decide to nuke Bryansk or Kursk? I mean, it could happen. Does he really want to trade shots with that? Right? Does he really want to do that? Look, I know he doesn't think ahead, but it isn't going to happen. And especially, it isn't 50-50. That's a flip of a coin.
Right.
That it's not going to happen. He wants you to believe it's going to happen, but it's not. And interestingly, he fired an intermediate range ballistic missile. He didn't fire one of his ICBMs because we don't know how many of those are actually working. Right? You owning an ICBM, it's not like buying a Maytag washer where it's going to work for the rest of your life. A nuclear warhead, without getting too detailed into it, look, they've got a shelf life that's measured, frankly, in months, especially a thermonuclear warhead. Part of their physics package includes tritium, which is triatomic hydrogen, and it can get through everything. It's like helium. You buy a tank of tritium, it just goes away. So they've got to be topped off, maintained, and think of the things that have to go right in a ballistic missile launch. Think it's like an orbital launch. Everything has to go right. And we saw for Mr. Putin, it didn't go right in his Dnipro strike, did it? He lost one missile.
Yeah. And actually, in recent tests of Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles, they've all failed. I mean, there have been explosions on the launch pad that destroyed the launch pad. So you have to question the viability of Putin's nuclear force for sure.
And absolutely, if he does this first use, he's going to have to expect a retaliatory strike. And it just, it's crazy. The other thing is, I don't think that NATO's response would instantly be nuclear. I think the response would be conventional, and it would rock his world. How is his air defense doing? Well, I don't know. Alibaba drones get through all the way to Moscow and hit targets. Right? What's he going to do if every single one of his oil facilities is blown to hell. What's he going to do if every tanker in every ocean that's carrying Russian crude gets torpedoed by a submarine? These are the kind of things. What's he going to do if the Baltic Sea is closed off? What's he going to do if the United States Navy interdicts every Russian ship all over the world? And I don't mean even necessarily sinking it, seizing it.
Mm-hmm.
He has the gross domestic product of Italy, and he wants to take on the world. That sounds like another great strategic thinker, a guy I'm a big fan of, and that was Benito Mussolini. He's a lunatic, this guy.
Yeah.
Lunatic.
I think that for everyone who gave their attention to these headlines today, the bottom line of Russia's use of this particular missile against Dnipro it's a terror tactic. And no one should think, as a result of just reading the headlines, for example, most of which said Russia launched an ICBM. This missile was not an ICBM. It doesn't move the clock towards nuclear midnight by a single second.
No, but look, he is desperate that you have that impression. And again, I just think back a couple of things. You know, in one point in my life, I was going to be a clinical psychologist. So there was a behavior, and behavior occurs. You witness it. You have to get back and say, why did this person behave in this way? What motivated them to do it? What impression was this supposed to have on me? Right? Well, you've taken this extraordinary step. You seem to be escalating. You are inferring that things are going to get terribly, terribly worse for you if you do this. If I do what? Provide Ukraine with the ability to strike back at you while you're engaged in the 10th or 11th year of your genocidal war? What are you afraid of, Vlad? He's afraid that NATO weapons, inadequate supply, will turn the tide of this war. And I agree with him. I think that will happen.
Yeah, it could, and it should turn the tide of this war. Putin says that he unleashed this weapon in response to storm shadows and ATACMS landing on Russian targets. Storm shadows used in Kursk. ATACMS, I believe, struck a ammunition depot in Bryansk. In Kursk, the storm shadows struck a command center. Has Ukraine had good success with its first use of storm shadows and ATACMS hitting targets inside Russia?
Absolutely. And there's a lot to unpack here, and we'll go back also. This will ricochet back to Putin's motivation. The ATACMS strike in Bryansk was actually targeting the 67th Arsenal at a place called Karachev. So again, these are what the military calls depot level facilities. So in this case, missiles, rockets, Iskanders, those sorts of things. And again, Ukraine, because it doesn't always have the really powerful weapons to hit these targets, they're always looking for a sympathetic target. An ammunition depot, for example. You hit it, you set it off, and it'll consume itself. You know, certain oil facilities, refineries, chemical plants, you damage it and it'll eat itself up. Interestingly, one of the targets of the Storm Shadow targeted a headquarters, higher level headquarters, where among the senior officers who were wounded was a senior North Korean general. And there are about 6 of them over there. I'm afraid I don't have the list in front of me, but I suspect this may have been the leader of North Korean Special Operations Forces. He was known to be forward deployed in Kyiv. Now let's go back to what's motivating Putin here. He invited his little buddy Kim's army to come in and join the war. Interestingly, the first reports stated that as many as 100,000 North Korean troops were preparing to enter the war. That number came up again today in the intellectual discussion. I was originally a bit skeptical, but I think now I've heard that number again and again, and it makes sense that we're talking about 3 divisions of troops. So if North Korea intended to help out, in their dream world, win this war with their Russian compatriots, 100,000 people is about it. Now, I want you to imagine that you are Vladimir Putin and you are sitting there, admiring yourself in the mirror. And in comes a guy and says, boss, the Ukrainians hit a headquarters in Kursk. They did it with one of those storm shadows you really hate, and they wounded General Wibako. And now Putin has to look at his little buddy and think, wow, okay, I just got one of your generals dinged. And backstage, that means the Ukrainians continue with their first-rate tactical intelligence, right? They've located this headquarters. They look at the radio traffic. They realize that they don't have a lot of storm shadows either. This is a viable storm shadow target. We are going to risk pilot, weapon, and everything else, and we're going for the gold. And they wounded that general. And that general, by the way, if anyone thinks he's going to do okay, now he's in the hands of Russian field medicine, and that's going to hurt.
Might even hurt more than the original wound. I think the story of Ukrainian intelligence that will be told after this war is going to be fascinating. There's no question that Ukraine knows so much. They are able to develop this list of targets and choose the top ones. Imagine what they could do with this list of key targets inside Russia or inside occupied Ukraine or in Crimea if they had sufficient weapons to tick off every single command post that they've identified, every single fuel and oil depot, ammo depot. Obviously, the Russian airfields, the Russian factories, they're not moving, but Ukraine doesn't have the weapon it needs to strike them.
Yeah, and I'll remind everybody that, hitting high value targets, admirals and generals, this is something that Ukraine has done incredibly well in this war. They hit a staff meeting in Izium where very likely they wounded General Gerasimov. They hit a meeting of the Black Sea Fleet and they probably killed the Black Fleet commander because we haven't seen him since the attempt at Weekends at Bernie's, where he was literally propped up in a bed with his eyes open during a staff meeting. So and they've killed 12 Russian generals. The other thing is you target a meeting because the sexy headline is you wounded a Russian general. But what you're doing is you're taking out the colonels and the lieutenant colonels and the majors on his staff. And it's not just like killing the baseball manager, that's taking out the whole team. So that's why decapitation operations, high value targets, targeting command nodes, you're going for the people, right? You're going for the people. And what a grim message for the North Koreans. So
yes, within weeks of their arrival, they've already lost one of their commanding generals. And that was the Storm Shadow attack in Kursk. I think we can expect more use of Storm Shadows and ATACMS this week as well. And of course, you're right, Chuck. Ukraine doesn't have that many Storm Shadows, doesn't have that many ATACMS missiles, and no one knows how many more they're going to be getting, actually. So Ukraine has really conserved this resource waiting for restrictions to be lifted on how they can be used. This, I think, shows the wisdom of Zelensky's impatience. We all saw him frustrated, angry, but his patience has now paid off.
Yeah, Ukraine needs so much. And you and I have been doing this for 1,000 days. If we had $5 for every time I said air defense, we'd be gazillionaires. Ukraine needs air defense. There is a problem with Putin's calculations here. So now he is attacking Ukraine with, MIRVs, right? So that is definitely a step up from your short range or tactical ballistic missiles like the Iskander, like the Scud, like those things. So what he is actually doing, he thinks he is terrifying the West. What he's actually doing is making the case better than you and I ever could that Ukraine needs air defense. Ukraine needs THAAD to up their defense so that their cities don't quite literally get nuked from orbit.
Yeah.
Right? He does not think ahead, but he never has to. There's no one to reflect ideas off of. No one dares suggest consequence. He acts unilaterally. And that's always the weakness of a dictatorship, unilateral action.
You think Putin is just going to use this IRBM once as a kind of look what I can do act, or isn't he more or less putting himself in the position of having to use this weapon again and maybe again and again?
Yeah, I think that is the risk. Look, he's demonstrated a 50% failure rate right now. He's making the wrong impression. But the more that he uses these weapons, and again, you're raining MIRV decoys down on a city, right? If he wanted to obliterate Dnipro, he should have fired 15 Iskanders at it, glide bombed it into the Stone Age. So again, he believes genuinely that somehow this is going to cause NATO to draw back. I think it's actually going to have the exact opposite effect. And again, I don't like to get into politics, but there's a new commander in chief. Without naming names, I don't think anyone would disagree with me that he has a very brittle ego. If he feels he's been hoodwinked, betrayed, made a fool of, this is the kind of person who's going to become incredibly vindictive, right? And there is so much more that NATO can do, frankly, without breaking a sweat. And if Putin is making this tantrum now, raining MIRVs down on truly a defenseless city, what's your next step? Right? No, he just doesn't think these things out. He just absolutely does not. This is not going to have the effect that he wants it to. It just isn't. It shows him to be increasingly irresponsible. And at some point, this may actually happen. Someone in the higher echelons of U.S. foreign policy and the dark arts are going to say, it's time to get rid of this guy. We no longer need him on the world stage. We don't need a guy who plays this fast and loose with these kind of toys. That hasn't happened yet, but it may.
No.
It may.
It's certainly a possibility. I don't know what the next joker in the deck would be in Russia.
See, there's the next step, right? This isn't regime change in Russia is not something that needs to be rushed into, right? Because the junior varsity Putin could be much worse than the monkey who's in there now.
Yeah, even the third team Putin. Now, supposedly Russia is stockpiling its more conventional cruise and ballistic missiles, intending some kind of massive strike on Ukraine in order to plunge Ukraine truly into the dark and cold of winter. Because Russia has been so successful in attacking Ukrainian power infrastructure, there are rolling blackouts throughout Ukraine right now. If you live in Kyiv, your lights are out probably for most of the day, 10 hours at a time. You might have 4 hours of power, except for critical energy needs across Ukraine. And this is very evenly meted out in Ukraine. So if you live in, whether you live in Lviv or Kyiv or Kharkiv or Odessa, you're all experiencing these rolling blackouts. And a massive missile strike unleashed by Putin could indeed finally plunge Ukraine into that cold, cold dark of the coming Ukrainian winter.
Well, that is definitely a possibility. In fact, I think it's a likely outcome. You know, let's take a bunch of these moves. Let's connect some of these dots. Olaf Scholz, who, as a young politician, was in fact a Marxist, was aligned with the Soviet Union, had much to do with trying to keep intermediate range missiles out of Europe. In fact, that was the Pershing missile. Olaf Scholz, who has so carefully scrupulously prevented higher grade German weapons from going to Ukraine. Olaf called Putin up, said he was concerned about escalation. The North Koreans, in fact, did so only because his own house was on fire and he was about to lose his job as chancellor. But I'd like to remind Mr. Scholz and his staff, you hung up the phone, and that night Putin launched the largest missile strike against Ukraine of the war. That was your answer. Thanks for calling. F you.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think that the incoming commander in chief would take too kindly to that kind of an interaction. And I don't doubt for 1 second that that is precisely what Putin would do. Precisely. I don't think he's going to do it yet because he still has a frankly unfounded hope that the dark corners of MAGA are going to come to his defense. That somehow he thinks that there are people in the United States that love Russia, that think whatever Russia does is good. And frankly, I've never met anyone who thinks it's good. I never have. Talking to people in all walks of life, no one's ever said to me, this is Ukraine's problem. I don't think so.
Yeah. I've never met such a person either, frankly. Well, we'll wait and see. January 20th is Inauguration Day. Also happens to be the deadline that Putin has imposed on his liberation force in Kursk to kick the Ukrainians out of Kursk. So January 20th is his deadline for that. But that's probably not going to go according to schedule if we see as many Russian desertions as we have seen reported recently. 1,000 Russians deserting from their positions in Ukraine.
Yeah, so let me find the unit number. Well, it's a bit actually irrelevant. It was a Guards motor rifle unit. They're missing 1,000 people. So I don't think they disappeared in one day or one weekend or 1 week. I have a hunch this is a rolling total. But look, that's approximately 2 battalions worth of people who have wandered off. Uh, Again, this is one of the problems of having people enter the armed service with no training. Right? They don't buy into the system. They don't they don't have any soldierly skills. They don't have any military bearing. They don't buy into the fact that this is a hierarchical organization and you take orders. But there's this uh, baked in weakness in the Russian army. So I won't get too psychological about it, but there's this social contract between officer and enlisted, between general and his unit. And that is in the best, most splendid case, you've got someone like Robert E. Lee or U.S. Grant up there. And the soldiers think, I may not know everything he does, but you know, he looks out for me. That's what holds an army together. If you don't have that, history shows us over millennia that the army will fall apart. It there's not a circumstance in any corner of military history where that isn't true. And you also think of the exact opposite. You think of Leonidas in Thermopylae with 300 people standing against 600,000 Persians. They counted on Leonidas, right? They so bonded with him that they were willing to lay down their lives with him. And that's another thing that history shows us always happens. Men and women will die for a leader they love. They will give their all. But if you convince them you don't care, you're going to lead them on the same stupid attack every day. Not lead them, you send them. You don't give them food, you don't give them water, medical care. The army is going to fall apart, as it did to the Russian Imperial Army in World War I. It came apart at the seams.
It did. It came apart at the seams, and it triggered, of course, the Russian Revolution. But you know, 1,000 desertions in Ukraine, that represents somewhere between what, 80 and 100 wave attacks on the zero line. So that's a significant weakening of Russian offensive strength on the zero line somewhere.
And this is just one unit. That's just one unit. So, you know, just having just glanced at the deep state map, there are probably 60 or 70, maybe even up to 100 different units operating from occupied Ukraine against the Ukrainian army. Let's just say that the desertion rate was 1/2 in all of those other units. Are we talking about 40,000 people who have wandered off? I truly think we might be.
It would be nice. I don't know where you go if you desert from the Russian front lines in Ukraine. You can surrender and go home alive, but and Ukrainian captures of Russian soldiers have increased lately, but particularly in Kursk, not so much down in Pokrovsk or
Yeah.
or Vuhledar, or you know.
Well, you know, there's also this when fighting is really heavy, you know, traumatized humans, no matter what the trauma is, including life and death and getting lead poisoning on the battlefield, traumatized humans will always pull together, right? They may not unite under a leader, but they will pull together. And anyone who's been in combat will tell you sooner rather than later, you realize as a combatant, you're in it with your guys, your platoon, right? Sebastian Junger wrote about that. He witnessed how a platoon pulls together. However, in the case of the Russian armed forces, the men pull together, but there's a disconnect, right? There is a disconnect. Men and women in the service know when they're being badly led. They know it. When we think of the thousands of attacks, and it is thousands that you and I have witnessed on video,
Yeah.
and we watch anything from a squad attack to a battalion attack, as we had in Kupiansk, they get mauled. They get destroyed. In Kupiansk, a battalion destroyed in 20 minutes. That might be a world record, really.
Yeah,
But there are video.
I do have to wonder how these Russian soldiers come back and fight again another day. I really I don't know how much longer they can do it. They've done it for 1,000 days. I guess they can only do it with new recruits to the front line who aren't fully aware of what's happened before. They're not told what's going to happen when they get there. They learn the hard way, but maybe that's just not a long enough time for them to turn against their commanders. I don't know.
No, I think you're right on. I remember during, Battle of Bakhmut, and especially when Wagner was dropping off busloads of people and hoiking them towards the Ukrainians. These people who arrive, they don't have enough training to know what is ridiculous and going to be instantly fatal. They don't know it. They just think, okay, we're going to pile on top of this armored vehicle and we're going to run right at them in daylight. When someone who'd been around the block would say, oh, in the brief, hey, wait a minute. Whoa, broad daylight? Are you kidding? Didn't we attack here yesterday?
But you got to wonder why, Chuck. Not one of those Russian soldiers are stopping to ask, why am I safer on top of the infantry fighting vehicle rather than inside it?
Well, this is a good time to just talk briefly about equipment, right? I did a thing for Sam at Business Basics, and we ran through some combat footage. Watched with our own eyes a Bradley fighting vehicle take a hit from an anti-tank missile and 2 first-person drones.
Wow.
And the vehicle was finally immobilized. I mean, it was hit 3 times. It just kept going. Finally, it's not going anymore. The back hatch drops and everyone runs away. Okay, run. Like, they're not wounded. They're not pulling dead people out of it. That's the safest place you can be. It's almost like being in a bank vault. Been in a Bradley and it gets hit, it just goes bong. So on the Russian side of the equation, hey, you got to ride on top because you don't want to get caught in this thing when it flips over and burns. Just one of the design falls there. We mentioned this a lot. The 2 back doors, the 2 hatches, they're full of fuel.
Yeah.
It boggles the mind.
It truly is the Edsel of the battlefield, or the Corvair of the battlefield. I don't know.
It sure looks cool, though. I mean, it looks cool, but it just is.
Well, we should move to a couple of maps here tonight, Chuck, both in Kupiansk and in Chaziv Yar. But I think we should begin in Kupiansk for a couple of reasons. President Zelensky visited Ukrainian troops in Kupiansk earlier, or within the last 4 or 5 days. He was within 15 kilometers of the front line. Kupiansk is one of the hottest spots on the zero line. Again, Zelensky displaying the kind of inspirational leadership for the entire nation of Ukraine, certainly for all of the Ukrainian soldiers defending their homeland.
Yeah, and I always we were taught to do this. You take your plan and your idea, and while you were working up your plan, you put the enemy's hat on, right? You whatever set of circumstances, facts, plans, ideation you have, we're taught to flip it. What's the enemy doing? Right? Well, here's something that's inconceivable, but casts a good light on what's going on the Ukrainian side. No one in their wildest dreams could imagine Putin visiting Bakhmut.
No.
That will never happen. He does, and then let's look at it. So why won't that happen? So let's not talk about personal cowardice. I mean, this guy's a bully and a thug, and he's had hundreds, maybe thousands of people killed. Why doesn't he go to Bakhmut? Because it just doesn't matter to him. He doesn't need to show his soldiers anything. He's the czar. You do what you're supposed to do. Again, those are the armed forces that will not be able to sustain a reversal, right? You don't think that the Russians know that President Zelensky visited Kupiansk? They know that, and they're going, I promise you, around some campfire, someone is saying, well, you'll never see Putin around here. Check, Ivan. Check. Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's exactly the same kind of leadership that Churchill and FDR showed during the Second World War. Churchill, of course, was renowned for wanting to get to the action even when he was prime minister. I think it took some doing, Chuck, to convince him that he couldn't be on board a naval vessel to watch D-Day.
Oh, God. Well, that's really it. I mean, Abraham Lincoln got his hat shot off in the defenses outside of Washington. That's what good leaders are. U.S. Grant was famous for wearing a private's uniform, right? He didn't wear his straps. He just, he wasn't fuss and feathers. But that's the connection between the leaders and the led, right? And that is every officer's military training in the West is about inculcating and facilitating that bond. And you have to earn it, right? You've got to earn it. Your guys and girls have got to see you. It isn't even necessarily an officer's place to do some of these things, but you're building a bunker. You're going to be there. Fill some goddamn sandbags, right? Something we always did in the military. You eat last. You make sure everyone is fed before you are. And you know what? I've never run out of food. There's always been something left for me standing at the end of the line. That's the men showing me what they thought. Because believe me, if I was a jerk, there wouldn't be anything left.
Right. Every last hot dog would be gone.
You got it. Oh, tough luck, bud.
Yeah.
You snooze, you'll lose.
Why did Zelensky choose Kupiansk to go to? It's because Kupiansk is such a hot spot on the zero line. And we were looking in the last show here, Chuck, at the Russian attempt to drive down the rail corridor that intersects with the H-26 in the middle of the eastern district of Kupiansk. I don't think they've made it that far yet, have they?
No, they haven't. But this is a place where, in similar terrain and similar situations of forest adjoining the industrial areas of a city, we saw this in Severodonetsk. We even saw it in Bakhmut. This situation to me is more analogous to Severodonetsk, where the Russians came out of a tree line and they were able to get an elementary school. And that was how they branched out. Kupiansk is a bit more difficult because, as we've talked about, there are two settlements on the east and west side of the Oskil. And you can see on the east side, if you are looking at that map, there is a triangle between the industrial areas in the northeast section of Kupiansk, forest going over to Petroplavivka, and then down to Polody, where there's been there's forest there. The whole purpose of taking Kupiansk would be to, take the intersection of the P79 and the H26. That's a laudable goal, but Ukraine has had a great deal of time to make every inch of the Russian approaches into a death trap. Mines, interlocking fields of fire, pre-planned artillery strikes. It's going to be very difficult for the Russians to take Kupiansk, but they're not going to stop. And they have made some progress, as we've seen. They actually got into Kupiansk once, and a couple of trucks painted to look like Ukrainian vehicles and Russian soldiers in Ukrainian uniforms. That was broken up, but hey, I'll give them an A for effort. They actually got into urban streets, but they were taken out. And to give you an idea of the fighting, this is where south of Kupiansk, south of Peshane, where the Russian battalion came to grief. The defeat in itself was tremendous. It was clinical. It was textbook. But then to find out that it took 20 minutes, I mean, look, I was astounded. A battalion ground up in 20 minutes. That's the kind of stuff that happened in World War I, right? I don't think there's an analogous situation in World War II, and almost no occurrence like that in the United States Army in its history, with the exception of maybe one or two Revolutionary War battles. So the military ineptitude is astounding.
Now, Ukraine wasn't able to follow up that success. I mean, I think this is what is analogous with such an event. If you compare it to something in World War I, no opportunity to follow up such a success in World War I either. And talk a little bit about that here in Kupiansk, Chuck. Is it simply a matter here as elsewhere on the zero line that Ukraine is outnumbered 5 or 10 to 1 in terms of manpower?
I think that's it. That is definitely one component of it. I think that in terms of material, Ukraine doesn't have enough stuff to follow up on that defeat, because there isn't a better opening you're ever going to get in warfare. You get attacked and you smash the attack to pieces in 20 minutes, and your enemy is fleeing before you. That's when you go in, right? But in order to go in, you've got to know where tomorrow's bullets are coming from. You've got to know 2 days from now, where are my logistics going to be in 2 days? And we've seen several dozen instances like this here in Kupiansk, around Kremenna and other places, where Ukraine is just not equipped. That's the wrong word. They're not well disposed enough to follow up on these victories. And that is a shame. And that also confirms this sort of defensive mindset that they're in. And they have to be, because they can't count on the United States delivering what they need. And they can't risk this massive counterattack that will eventually falter because it can't be supported. So they're doing what is rational, and it is the right thing to do. As much as you want to shove it down these guys' throats, and that's how battles are won, right? They fall apart in front of you, and you hammer them. You stay on them, and one day Ukraine is going to be able to do that. One day, but you know what? I don't see that happening until next autumn.
Probably at the earliest. Ukraine really does have to pick and choose where it can launch a a counter attack of any size. They chose to launch, of course, a very surprising counterattack in Kursk. But other counterattacks, say down in Pokrovsk or down around Kurakove, those are all completely defensive in nature, not intended in any way to break through Russian lines, simply to, well, I guess simply to empower the defensive positions that Ukraine has and hopes to hold.
Yeah, and the lemonade they're making out of these lemons are that they are in a defensive posture and fighting what are attritional battles with the Russians. And they're doing that with some success. So we've seen the daily casualties. I remember when the numbers were in the 300s. Then they were consistently in the 500s. Then they were consistently in the thousands. Now they routinely go up to 1,500 per day. And Ukrainian losses and Russian losses are generally thought to be one Ukrainian casualty for 4 Russian casualties. You know, every Ukrainian loss is to be mourned and, has a detrimental effect on their forces, the force posture, material readiness, everything else. But I don't think there's an army on earth, with the exception of perhaps the Chinese, who have not been in combat in almost 50 years.
Yeah.
And that didn't go well when they tried to invade Vietnam. They got a big surprise. But there isn't a present army that would allow this war to continue with the daily casualties that they have. Every other armed force would push the reset button and say, we need new generals, we need new officers. This isn't working out. But again, that disconnect between Putin, his people, and the minions that do his bidding, which dooms them. It dooms their effort in this war. It truly does. And as we saw in the Kharkiv offensive, the Russians fled 40, 50, 60 kilometers a day. The First Guards tank army evaporated. No one knows how many prisoners they took. It could conceivably have been tens of thousands. And that'll happen again when we get rid of Jake Sullivan and we get some Olaf Scholz, perhaps. It'll happen again.
And hope that Europe and the United States continue to supply Ukraine with more of what it needs, much, much more of what it needs. Attritional battle in Kupiansk, Ukraine on the defensive. I think probably the longest running defensive battle has been taking place in Chasiv Yar, Chuck. And again, Ukraine could not hold a better defensive position from which to fight an attritional war.
Absolutely. I was going back, I've got my maps broken up by, I've got the Bakhmut file, the Kupiansk file, at every battle space, and going back and seeing just the creeping Russian advance. And there is no military artistry here. I am unwilling to call Russia's gains this summer. I'm unwilling to call that an offensive. It isn't offensive. You think of George Patton, think of General Sherman, think of those are offensives, right? These are just these grinding, unending pinpricks that just keep going on. And, What's it been? We've been covering Bakhmut for 3 years now. They still haven't gotten to Chasiv Yar. Just up the road in Kremenna, they've finally gotten to the Zarabets River, but they still don't control the whole reservoir. So you could see, and this is what I mean by anyone else fighting this war. The Pentagon, look, these numbers just they don't jive, right? You give a general officer a battalion to command and he gets it wiped out in 20 minutes. Well, he's gone and people are going to say, we got to make sure this never happens again. What are we doing? Right? Well, they'd be saying things like, well, you're attacking in broad daylight. You keep attacking down this same road. You don't have any artillery preparation. The men aren't trained. The officers are nowhere near this operation. They're not leading it from the front. They're remote controlling it from the back. So, but those are the lessons and the realizations that Russia will never make. They aren't reflective. They don't have battle laboratories, right? They don't look at things, and they don't care how many men they lose. That's like how many bullets we shoot. We don't care about that. It's, and it's only the Western mindset that does. And it's important to understand what makes Russian leadership tick. And it's sobering when you realize zero F's given. We lose 2,000 people a day. We don't care.
Well, you can go back in time here and see the cost of that carelessness between Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut. In fact, it would be really interesting to go back and look at the maps last April, March, February, and trace that battle of Bakhmut. And I'll remind viewers, I remember specifically in Chasiv Yar, someone filmed the panorama of the destroyed Bakhmut. You can stand in Chasiv Yar and see all of Bakhmut in front of you. And the point of this particular video was to show its destruction. But that is the commanding vantage point of Chasiv Yar, one that Russia really wants to take. They haven't really made much progress to that since last April, Chuck. This is how long it's been going on.
Yeah, and this is the conventional military way to take Chasiv Yar. You have a massive probe to the north of the city and a massive probe to the south, and you meet at a place. There is a little village there, which is the exact center that two converging prongs should meet. It's a place called Stinky. Sorry for them, but that's their name. That's how you take Chasiv Yar. Everyone knows that. Why doesn't that happen? A bunch of reasons. They don't have soldiers trained to the standard to conduct this kind of maneuver warfare. They don't have junior officers who are trained enough to lead their small units in a cooperative effort in a dynamic situation and make things happen on the battlefield, right? As a SEAL commander, if you get cut off from communications, you don't come back and say, I wasn't talking to headquarters. Get it, finish the mission. It's that way in a SEAL platoon. You kill the platoon commander, the assistant commander will take over. You kill him, the chief takes over. You kill him, the leading petty officer takes over. You kill him, the fire teams are going to operate on their own. It's a hydra. And that is the way the entire U.S. military operates in its ground forces. You kill the company commander, the XO takes over. And they know commander's intent, right? They know that we want to converge on Stinky and surround Chasiv Yar, and they will all make it happen. You lose communications. Look, the general told you what we're doing, right? Press on, adapt, improvise, overcome. All that's great. None of that goes in the Russian army. Zero. I told you where to go. I told you when to go, and I told you how to get there. And you don't exceed your orders. You can't win a war like you just can't. The Russians prove that every day because look, things are tough right now and they're going to be tough this winter, but everyone needs to remind themselves Russia isn't winning. They're not.
I
They're
think
just not.
everybody does have to remind themselves of that fact. Russia isn't winning. In the course of the summer, they've taken about 1% more of Ukrainian territory. And I said this a couple of shows ago, Chuck. We do focus on maps, and therefore people tend to focus on territory, but territory isn't what is at issue here. Yes, Ukraine wants to kick every Russian soldier off its territory, and that is in order to free a nation and to free occupied Ukraine and to continue into Ukraine's future of democracy and progress, membership in the EU, membership in NATO. They are fighting, yes, this horrific war of self-defense, but they know exactly why they are fighting to save their homeland, to save their very homes and their loved ones, their families, and also to preserve the future that they have chosen for themselves, a future of democracy in Europe and as an ally of NATO and democracies all around the world. Pretty compelling reasons to fight.
Absolutely. And one of the belligerents started this war as a global superpower on a 72-hour special military operation to bring Ukraine to heel. 1,000 days later, 700,000 Russian casualties later, their situation is now so desperate that they are firing ballistic missiles, strategically capable weapons at Ukraine and telling the world that you better not get NATO weapons involved. That's not what winners do, right? This isn't a win. They've lost a number of people that is comparable to World War II. They've lost almost twice as many people in 1,000 days as the United States lost in 4 years of global war, Europe and the Pacific together. That's staggering. Let's not forget that. This is a quagmire for Putin. It is. Ukraine is nowhere close to quitting. They are not. And Putin is a long, long way from victory lane.
This war is going to continue to unfold. It's unfolding in a painfully slow way, of course, but there's no way to speed up history, Chuck. There is only one way to help Ukraine finish the job, and that is to give them more of what they need, everything that they need. Maybe right now, beginning with extraordinary air defense, because we anticipate some more massive assaults coming from Russia, maybe with more MIRV ballistic missiles, we don't know. But the bottom line, as we started the show with, Chuck, was don't focus too much on the headline. Rather, take Chuck's advice and focus on what Putin wants you to feel. He wants you to feel terrified that we are a minute closer to nuclear midnight. The clock hands haven't moved a single second.
Absolutely not. And I put up a political cartoon this week showing Putin with a pistol at his own head, holding up a paper that says nuclear threats. Right. That will be the last foreign policy mistake he ever makes. And it is so obvious. It is absolutely so obvious. And if he thinks he's fighting NATO now, he doesn't have a clue.
And he always claims to be fighting NATO. Russian propagandists have reported NATO soldiers in the field in any number of battles, etc. But yeah, if Putin wants to fight NATO, I'm sure NATO's ready to take on that challenge.
Yeah, I think so as well. And especially, if he gets out of his lane, attacking any member of NATO, it's going to trigger Article 5. And there are thousands of dire consequences beyond a nuclear response from NATO. And I mean interdicting every Russian ship in every ocean all over the world. They can't prevent that. They can't stop NATO from doing that. Closing the Baltic, they can't stop NATO from doing that. Closing Vladivostok, mining Russian harbors. It just goes on. It just goes on and on. So it would be an egregious mistake, and it shows how juvenile this man is. You know, how impulse-oriented he is. And again, I'm happy to remind everybody, on the day before the invasion, I thought he'll never do it. It's so stupid. He can't do this. I didn't factor in the cray-cray.
No, you didn't. I haven't factored it in here on day 1002 either, because it is so hard to factor in. You just respond with astonishment at the next thing that Putin does. Chuck and I will be back here with indications and warnings to cover whatever that thing may be. But what we will be doing here, always on indications and warnings, is following the story of Ukraine's heroic self-defense and looking at every way possible to help Ukraine win this war. And that's why at the end of every indications and warnings, it's always to Chuck, Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava. Do what you can do, folks. We're going to help you win, dominate in your information microcosm. So take them on at the pub, at the bar, and good luck at Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Chuck, and good night.
Thanks, Alan. See you soon.